Like the title of the video says, we're going to be covering all of the changes that have happened to support Ash in the recent Castle Kandar patch for Evil Dead the game. Now, there is a bunch of stuff that is going on. There is a lot of different changes. There's a meta shift. Let's jump into it. So the first and probably the biggest thing that changed with supports in general is the fact that all support healing ranges have been normalized. Now, the patch notes say that they have been normalized to 8 meters. This is untrue. It is actually 10 meters as of testing it. So that means when you use a Shimps or an Amulet as any of the supports, it is now going to be from a range of 10 meters. Now, support Ash and Pablo, this is obviously a buff for them. For Cheryl, it's actually a nerf. Cheryl had 15 meters before the patch, now it's 10, so this normalizes them in a big and heavy way. I think this was a good change in general. I think the 5 meters was just too small and the 15 was too big. I think 10 meters is probably, I would say, a sweet spot. So I definitely think they should leave it at 10 and not nerf it down to 8 because that's what their patch notes say, but we'll go ahead and just leave that alone for now. So let's get into Sash specifically. First thing, we're going to talk about Reassuring Presence. Now, there were no changes to this skill, so don't panic. You didn't miss a note or anything. However, I do think this skill is better than it was before. This might be a little confusing, but let me explain. I've played a good bit of Demon, and just because of the changes that they performed on Demon, basically removing early game possession spam, and making it to where certain skills like the possession skill itself is locked behind demon level, it's going to be a lot harder for demons, especially non-puppeteer demons, to just spam out units constantly. This is especially true for things like Warlord and Necromancer, where they're going to have to focus more on their economy and focus more on their XP per minute than before. This means that fear and possession of survivors, which is a big XP component for demons, is going to be much stronger, much more important. That also means that characters, survivors that can mitigate fear like Lash or Sash, are actually going to be stronger in this meta than they were before because they can deny a lot of that XP that the demon would be able to get otherwise. So this skill, even though it didn't change, because of the meta shift, it's actually stronger now. Jumping down into his second ability, Alternative Healing. This thing has a bunch of different changes. Let's go ahead and just read what it does now. Successful heavy melee attacks partially restore health for you and nearby teammates. Damage restored as health 20%. There's a lot to unpack here. First, let's talk about the wording of the skill itself. It says successful heavy melee attacks. This means that if you do not deal damage, you do not heal. It's just as simple as that. That means if you're heavy attacking a unit that is in a finisher currently, whereas pre-patch, pre-Castle Kandar patch, you could actually heal from a unit being finished. Now, because you don't deal damage, you don't actually heal from it. In addition to that, when you're attacking a Necromancer that has a shield up, because you deal no actual health damage to it, you do not do any healing from it. This means that it's going to be a lot more important to get around that shield or to knock that shield out of a Necromancer's hands than it was before as Sash. It also means that you're going to have to be attacking units and trying to maximize your damage because, as we see down there, it scales off of the percentage. The pre-patch amount was 25 per hit. This means that it was very incentivized to go towards weapons that had very fast attack rates. Now that it's a percentage of the damage done, you actually want to be aiming for DPS and effective DPS rather than just speed. This actually ends up meaning that most of your best weapons are going to be the slow 1-speed weapons, things like sledgehammers, things like swords and axes. And I would actually give the edge to the blunt weapons over the sharp weapons. The reason for that being, A, you contribute more balance bar with the blunt variants than you do with the sharp variants. This also helps you remove shields from Necromancers, but there's an additional reason even besides that. While the blunt weapons actually have slightly lower DPS than the sharp variants, they have much bigger swings. Their animations tend to be huge horizontal swings for their heavy attack patterns, for their combos, so in general, it's going to be a lot easier to get AoE hits using shovels and bats and sledgehammers. Now, that isn't to say that like the sword and other 1-speed weapons can't do AoE, but they all seem to have overhead attacks built into their combos very prevalently. And I'm thinking of, for instance, the axe initial attack is definitely a vertical and not a horizontal swing. So just keep that in mind, that some of those one speed weapons, you're generally going to get more value out of the blunt weapons, both from the balance bar and just how the combos work themselves. Now, at low rarities, you're definitely going to want a slow weapon. At higher rarities, you get a little bit more flexibility. There's two weapons in particular that I think really come online once you get into the purple or legendary quality, and the beautiful thing about them is that you might actually be able to get them as the support. The first being the hunting knife. Now, the hunting knife has always sort of been a sash weapon. It has really fast attack speed, and it's actually a little bit faster than before, so they changed how some of the combos work in the game. The actual combos themselves seem to be a bit faster, especially with the faster weapons, but then there's a recovery time after the fourth hit. This means that a lot of those combos for 3-speed and 5-speed weapons are actually a little bit more practical, whereas you can do the attacks, you can get more attacks in the middle, and then you can dodge out and reset when that fourth hit happens. Now, the only two weapons I think that are good, even at higher rarities, like we talked about, were the hunting knife, and then the other one is the spear. Now, the spear is a little bit different than the knife. It doesn't have quite the DPS at higher rarities. However, they also changed it to be a little bit faster, a little bit more clean to use. It doesn't feel as wonky as it used to. So I'm not 100% sure how they changed it exactly, but it feels better. But it also has really long range, and its attack patterns are very, very horizontal with its heavy attacks. So it's very easy to cleave enemies and get multiple enemies per swing. So at low rarities, definitely be on the lookout for blunt 1 speeds. At higher rarities, you get a little bit more flexibility. Really anything will do, but you're going to often see warriors and even leaders leaving those legendary spears and those legendary knives on the ground. You're going to want to pick those up. Those are really, really good for you now. Now let's talk about a little bit more how to build into alternative healing. So the first thing, obviously because it's based on the amount of damage, you're going to be able to take perks that increase this. Now, Devastating Force, I think, is now a very big contender for skill points on Sash. Now, before, I never really condoned going for damage. However, you can kind of double tap now with Devastating Force, getting the damage and the healing component because it scales off of how much DPS you're doing. So I think Devastating Force could definitely be worth it. I would be a little bit more hesitant on what I would take out though. Tougher Than Tougher Than Hell isn't a really great thing to drop. We've already kind of dropped Seeing Stars points. I wouldn't recommend dropping Shimps Plus, especially now that Sash has buffed healing ranges. Fear is more important than ever, so it's kind of hard to drop this. Ambulance is maybe an option. And then Industrial Strength is obviously very good for support. So all the survivability stuff is very hard to drop in my opinion. So you're going to have to figure out where you're going to get those points from if you want to take Devastating Force. Now, the last word I think is not worth it, and I'm pretty certain about that. And the reason is it's just really impractical to get that last hit in a lot of situations. Now, if you averaged out that 50% damage across all hits, it would actually be about 12.5%, so it's outright weaker than Devastating Force, and it only ever works if you don't have to dodge out of the way and reset your combo. It only works if you don't have to run away. It only works if your enemy doesn't die from the second or third hit. So there's a lot of situations where Last Word just isn't going to proc. I highly recommend against going into this perk as Sash, even though it might increase your melee healing. So I think that covers it for alternative healing and how it kind of works. Oh, one last note, taking Arthur's or El Jefe's can actually boost your alternative healing as well. So those characters do have a synergy with your alternative healing. Moving down to Mark Target. Now this thing got as many changes as alternative healing did. Let's go ahead and jump into it. So Mark Target used to, and we'll cover how it used to work, mark a target whenever Sash lands a headshot. Now that mark is a green sparkler that exists on their head, and any sort of damage at all would consume it. That means if you did a running heavy, that kick thing that does like 10 damage, that would consume it. A melee attack would consume it. A ranged attack would consume it. Now it only procs off of ranged damage. That means you cannot heal or deal damage when you mark a target off of melee attacks. So this is a super big change, a super important change. However, it is also buffed. So that is outright a nerf, but they also buffed it in the fact that it is now not consumed at all. It does not get consumed. It is actually a debuff that lasts for 5 seconds. Now, even though the healing portion doesn't list a duration, it is also 5 seconds, so just keep that in mind. But that 5-second duration allows you to have a much higher efficiency on ammo for Sash, so he doesn't have to spam attacks, spam bullets every 3 seconds, every 2 seconds. You can just go boom and then wait 5 seconds, boom and then wait 5 seconds. So it's a lot better on ammo consumption for the Sash, but in general it's going to lead to a lot higher DPS numbers from the not from the supports, from the hunters and from the leaders. And the big reason is because your shotguns are now not going to consume the damage mark on the first pellet. All of the pellets are going to get that damage boost, and shotguns were the meta, and I still think, even though they got nerfed a little hard, I still think they're a little bit better than some of the other weapons just from a DPS perspective. So in general, I think this is overall an actual buff for marked target damage. It doesn't feel quite as wonky, quite as exploity. It does what it actually says that it does, so that's always a good thing. However, let's jump into the healing component, which did just get outright nerfed. It kind of got gutted a little bit. So the fact that it lasts 5 seconds is nice. That is good. However, the percentage went from 30% to 10%. This is a massive nerf. A massive nerf. And the reason why it's a massive nerf is because the way that you mostly heal, especially because it's only range damage now, is by using single pellet, highly concentrated weapons. Things like the blunderbuss and the crossbow and the revolver, taking things like last chance just to buff up that one single pellet to absurd numbers like 1500 or even approaching 2000. Now you're probably not going to see 2000 numbers anymore, or getting close to that without a bunch of like leaders in the mix, but suffice it to say that this skill will not heal for a lot, even on a hunter or even on yourself when you're marking the target. Now the 10% basically means that whenever you kill a target with using something like a shotgun, you're only going to land probably 2, maybe 3 pellets, especially if you're a hunter, sometimes even only 1 pellet, depending on how buffed they are and things of that nature. So you're only going to be probably dealing 300 damage a pellet, and if you kill it, that's only 30 health. That is not very much. Whereas using a blunderbuss or something like it, you're probably going to be doing well over 1,000 damage per shot, and all of that overkill damage ends up counting as the heal, so you end up getting 100 health back from it instead of like 30 or 50 or whatever. And I think that's the fundamental problem with the way they're trying to balance this skill. I definitely think they should buff this up to 20% damage and then just give it a cap. So I definitely think there's a problem with using something like a blunderbuss for a hunter to full heal themselves in a single shot. That's way too much. It's way overkill. However, it also nerfs it for characters like supports or even leaders, or using weapons like shotguns. So I definitely think this thing needs to go more towards something like 20% and then cap it at maybe 100 health per shot or 100 health per enemy or something like that. Maybe even 150 if that's not enough, but make it to where abusing overkill damage isn't as important as just doing practical sensical damage, if that makes sense. The final thing that I want to talk about on Sash is actually a change that happened for all supports, and that change is the fact that industrial strength is no longer bugged, so feel free to take the 4th point. In addition, they snuck in another change, and that is that supports have 5 points in Pink F. Now before you get too excited, the 5th point does not double. Now previously Pink F for health doubled every single level. It went from 25 to 50 to 100 to 200. The 5th point does not give you 400, it only gives you 250. Now if you combine the Pink F bonus with the 4th point in industrial strength, it's going to give supports about 95 extra health to work with. That's not bad. It actually ends up being a very decent amount of health. So that is obviously just a straight buff, and that's for all supports as well. Now it is early days in the patch. I very well could have missed something or misrepresented anything. If you guys see it, call me out, let me know. I'm still learning too, and thanks for watching.